Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and I am back with another cards video. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the newly revealed escalation cards. Over the past couple days, we've seen all 7 cards revealed, and I'm just going to essentially just give some thoughts on them. So we'll just kick it off by the order they were revealed in, and that starts off with the 60th Cavalry Regiment. It is a 4-credit Soviet infantry. It is special rarity. It has 1 operation cost. It is a 3 attack and 6 health. And then it has ambush, and players can only give 1 order each turn. So this is seemingly somewhat going to be of a tech card, is the first thing. Namely, I think the thing most people think of is that it is a natural counter to something like resistance. Notably because of cards like Imperial Decree that essentially need to be combined with other orders in order to actually work. There's also other things such as Tora. The Last Rites especially relies on being able to cast multiple orders alongside all of the French ones, such as Viva la Resistance, Liberation, Phony War, and all the others. And it could have a purpose there. It is a very hard effect counter to them if it stays on the board, however, is that main thing. It is not guaranteed that 60th Cavalry is going to stick on the board. 3-6 is a pretty decent stat line, but it leaves it vulnerable to most removal in the game. Most decks are going to be able to have some removal-based order that they can use to get 60th Cavalry off the board. However, needless to say, it is another tool that the Soviets or anybody using a Soviet ally could potentially use to bind the enemy up. I don't think 60th Cavalry alone is going to really, completely shut down a deck like Resistance, but it's another threat that they have to deal with. And if they end up spending too much removal on other cards, one of these coming out late game potentially shuts down any big plays they would try with like Last Rites to burn you out. So there is maybe some good potential here. And it is just on a good body. 3-6 is pretty, durable, and ambush makes it pretty good at trading and contesting the front lines. So it overall seems like a solid card. I think Soviet Value will definitely consider this, but there may also be other decks that, use this in various ways. The one problem is that this is a bit awkward with a card like Bloody Sickle, which most Soviet decks are running because, it's such a cheap 1-credit order that you just, really want to be playing that, alongside other orders or whatever, and you can't if you have 60th on the board. So there's a bit of a trade-off there, but overall, I do think that we'll probably see use out of it and just probably see it find its way into at least 1 or 2 decks. Moving on, we have Southern Plan up next. It is a Japanese special. It is a 4-credit order, and it gives you an extra credit slot, and the enemy then loses an extra credit slot. So essentially, you are taking one of their credits and gaining it yourself. And that is quite a powerful effect. We've seen very limited ways to blow up the enemy's credits, and we've seen even those, when they're played, do some pretty nasty stuff. Most notably, Britain has had a few of these effects. Notably, shelling is probably the most common, but there's also daylight bombing, and I believe these are pretty much the only credit destructions in the game. But even still, those are there is also strategic bombing, my bad. But that's it in terms of them. You could only normally get about 4 to 5 of them, or maybe 2 or 3 of them in a deck at a time, at least consistently. But now you're going to be able to potentially combine them with Southern Plan, which is also going to be ramping you and blowing the enemy credits up. You have about 5 of these now if you play a British-Japanese deck, so there could be some very annoying elements in there. Being able to cripple your enemy and leave them on stranded on 2 to 3 credits while you reach 7 or more could be really, really powerful. The question is that enough to make Japan a reasonable control ally? That remains to be seen, as there are some stiff competition from stuff like Italy, who offers very powerful control tools that fits better into Britain's game plan. So we might see it maybe not make it there, but there is some other options. Notably, there is an idea of potentially making a Japan-US ramp deck. And essentially the idea is that using Southern Plan alongside stuff like War Machine and Hour of Need, you're able to really pull ahead in credits, and then you're going to use big blitz planes like the Kika or the Hein, or even the Shiden, and you're just going to blitz the enemy down, dealing tons of damage with just tons of burn damage, and essentially a more aggressive type of ramp deck, while still backing it up probably with stuff like B-17s and Avengers. This is an interesting deck, I think, to consider, although I am hesitant to say whether it is going to actually end up that good. One of the biggest things that might hold this back is that you are playing a nation like Japan who doesn't have the best control tools. Notably, Japan has a few decent guards, none of them are particularly awful, but in particular, they don't really have any healing, and the US doesn't add much itself, the only real option potentially being We Can Do It, which I don't know if we want to run specifically in a deck like a Japanese ramp deck. So I think that's going to be maybe a difficult thing, although maybe you can make it work. But regardless, I do think that Southern Plan looks very powerful. It might not show up everywhere, and there might be some kinks in finding where it really fits. But I think this effect honestly is very powerful and is probably going to see play somewhere in a deck. In fact, probably the place it'll most likely fit into is Resistance itself. You slow the enemy down while getting closer to being able to combo off with your big expensive orders and board clears. And that seems like a pretty good spot if you can find the room for it. Otherwise, like I said, maybe this is a step in the right direction. This is, I think, also a step in the right direction for like a Japanese control deck or even a ramp list. I don't think it alone is going to do it, but I don't think we're going to... I think it's definitely powerful enough to start moving us there. And if Japan can get some better control tools, like maybe some better early to mid-game removal, some better ways to swing the board, and even some healing finally, I think you could really make it work. Next up, we move on to the elite of the expansion, the 5th Medical Battalion. It is a U.S. elite. It costs 4 credits, has an operation cost of 1. It has 0 attack and 5 health. It is an infantry. And then it has the text, your other units have +1 attack and are fully repaired at the end of your turn. So this is a pretty powerful effect. +1 attack on all of your units is a pretty powerful set of words that can appear on cards. Notably, Japan makes constant use of the Type 93, which is a 1/1 for 1 credit. Granted, it is very, very cheap, and it is technically a tank, so it can apply a bit more pressure itself. But that +1 attack is really the thing. You're able to play this down and then swing in and get an extra 2 to 3 damage out of units, all for just very cheap and without the enemy being able to do stuff. Now, the 5th Medical Battalion is more expensive. 4 credits is a much more sizable chunk of credits to spend on something, but it also has a much better body for sticking around. 5 health is quite durable, and it also has that text of repair. Now, repair is something that is sometimes good, but not always. Repair has been one of those keywords that is always like kind of weird in whether it's good or not. Notably, I'm going to talk about this in U.S. Frontline. And if you take a look at the various cards in the deck, most of them are only about 1 to 3 health, at least for maybe the more standard versions. There are definitely some units like the Skytrain, Sherman, and Catalina that have more, but the deck is not going to benefit as much outright as something like or it won't benefit as much from the repairs, although I don't think it is going to be a negative either. Being able to potentially trade into a small unit with like your Whirlwind or, whatever you want to say, the Red Devils, anything, and then being able to give them back that health, essentially making free trades, is quite a powerful effect and does give the medical battalions some extra utility. I think overall it does slot nicely into U.S. frontline or mid-range. The deck is slow enough that you can potentially get out a big enough board that you are able to benefit from the +1 attack, even with the semi-high cost. But I also want to theorize that potentially you could lean into a sort of bigger U.S. frontline deck. Now, there's no way to test this at the moment, but using stuff like the M4A1, which is a very big unit on its own, 4/5, can't be targeted by enemy orders, stuff like the Panzer III-H, and even stuff like the Panther G, all could potentially benefit from this massive, from not only from having a little bit of extra attack, but mostly benefiting from the repair effect. And potentially, if you build it right, you can have a deck that is able to hit even higher or even harder in the late game, while still retaining its early game aggression that this deck is kind of known for. And potentially, you could try to go over other U.S. aggro decks, which is something that can be potentially a powerful thing. When a deck like U.S. Frontline is meta, typically in card games, there is sort of this arms race of each of players essentially in mirror matches trying to outlast each other. Sometimes they can also snowball a win in the early game, but very often you can see whoever usually manages their resources better and gets better trades comes out on top. So potentially using Medical Battalion and another card we're going to talk about in a minute, alongside some bigger units, you're able to potentially go above the enemy and you'll be able to potentially win more consistently in the mirror. On top of that, going bigger also generally gives you better chances against control decks. You can very much frustrate certain decks by having that repair, like Japan Resistance could find that repair really annoying if they don't fully commit to board clears every single turn. So that could potentially balance everything or potentially power you up even further. So that's an interesting deck to think about, but I do think Medical just on its own will probably work its way into U.S. Frontline just outright. Speaking of that card that could go into potentially a big mid-range deck, the M4A2. This is a U.S. limited tank. Costs 6 credits and has 2 operation costs. It is a 4/4, and it has deployment at an M4A2 to your support line. Essentially, this is getting 2 4/4 tanks in a single card. That is actually quite the powerful effect. Notably, unlike most big, expensive, and somewhat slow units, the M4A2 splits itself apart, meaning that single target removal is much less effective against this card. And I think that is a very notable thing, is that you're able to potentially have always stick at least part of this unit, and it's also immune to retreat effects or bounce effects because then you just create more M4A2s. So this seems like a really annoying card, with its biggest downside being that it's pretty slow. 6 credits do nothing is dangerous and can lead to you falling behind. Although 4/4 is just big enough to dodge most common board clears. Stuff like carpet bombing doesn't get rid of it. Stars and stripes, strategic bombing, most AoEs in resistance, unless they really commit into it with like multiple Imperial Orders and Toras and Desperate Measures. So there is the potential, I think, for the M4A2 to make its way into frontline, although I will say I find it less likely than medical. The big reason being that the M4A2 is just a lot slower. And if we take a look at US frontline one more time, it is just overall meant to be a bit faster. So that's why I theorize that it could be interesting to experiment with a slightly slower but more resilient deck. There is the idea of potentially leaning into Bolster again, which was a very powerful card, and then kind of disappeared with the nerf to the Fury Panzer Grenadier. But maybe the new M4A2 is enough of a durable threat alongside Bolster that you could make a deck that more reliably is able to just kind of kill control decks by being just so difficult and annoying to deal with. That is mostly speculation, and how you would build a deck exactly like that is a bit hard to say, but I think it is interesting to think about. However, there is also more options for the M4A2. Notably is that instead of running it in frontline or even some sort of big frontline, you could just run it in ramp. Ramp is always kind of interested in big, hard-to-remove threats. It's always a deck looking to really get in there and just play out its big units. And this is the deck tech you saw last time, so it's a bit different, but it's always has these big late game threats of stuff like the Pershing, the B-17, the Avengers, all that. And it's able to oftentimes want to create overwhelming boards. And the M4A2 could help with that. You often see decks running Seaborne Invasion. Some are even running Mass Deployment. And a variety of things like that. And the M4A2 could offer kind of essentially a mini version of those. But it being much cheaper is a benefit because you can possibly use it to help brawl for the front line after ramping. So there is some options there. And at the very least, I think it's a good card for a budget ramp deck. When you don't have like Seaborne Invasions or B-17s or mass deployments or Pershings, you're able to, at the very least, potentially fall back on the M4A2 as a mini version of those, and you could potentially make that work, which is something I always like to see. But I do think that the M4A2 is honestly it should at least be tested in pretty much any US deck. It seems pretty powerful, and I honestly expect it to find play somewhere, whether that is in some US frontline deck, maybe it spawns its own big brother of the US frontline, whether Ramp maybe starts running some copies. I have a feeling it's going to see play somewhere, and it's going to work somewhere. It just seems like a very flexible card due to the fact that it's so much stats split across multiple bodies in a way that is good enough to not just instantly get wiped to board clears. Overall, seems very, very good. Moving on to the next card, it is a Soviet limited. It is a 5-credit order, Machines of War, and it says, add the top Soviet infantry unit in your deck to your support line. So this is an interesting one. looking at the expensive Soviet infantry, it is a bit hard to see how to build this deck. If you look at the various Soviet infantry, you have 272nd, which is a great card, actually. The 272nd is probably the single best pool from it. You do have the 25th Infantry Regiment, which is a decently big guard. That's nice. And then you potentially have the 17th Rifle Regiment, who mainly works because he has Blitz, so he can immediately trade. But beyond that, there isn't a whole lot. You have to start resorting to stuff like 222nd Guards Rifle, or even something like 6th Airborne. And 6th Airborne doesn't really work because it's essentially just a 6/8 infantry. Because you don't get deployment effects from stuff like Machines of War. And I think this causes some problems. It's just very limited in the package you can run. And if you look, you end up giving up some potentially powerful infantry to do stuff like this. Stuff like the 329th Engineer, the 845th Rifles is an option, is something that could occasionally see play. The Cuban Cossacks, and even something like First Rifles. You know, these are generally rare cards or infantry that see play. So having to forego those and any other infantry that you might want to run to pull off Machines of War is hard to say if it's worth it. I think at the moment it's not going to see play. I think the pool is just too limited with pretty much just 3 options, and none of those being, and only really the 272nd being like a really fantastic pool. If 25th was maybe a bit bigger, like let's say a 7/8 for 8 credits, I could see it, or maybe if it added like more light infantry, maybe. 17th, if it hadn't been nerfed a while ago, so long ago, and had the 1 operation cost, I could see it. But I don't think that overall it's just, you don't have the package there yet. But it is an interesting card to keep eyes on, because there are potentially, it might only be maybe one big Soviet guard away from being a reliable package. You got the 272nd, like I keep saying, but 25th is also not particularly awful. It could be there as a filler option, and if you got one more really good big infantry, maybe it is worth building around and being able to cheat out these giant guards in the mid-game. There is always the worry that they're going to get bounced, which is a big problem. But metas can always change, and decks that are bounce heavy might not be meta when Machines of War gets good. So it's kind of, I guess we'll have to see. I think right now it's going to be more of a fun deck, and I definitely plan on probably building a deck tech around it. But I think overall it just needs a little bit more in order to really work out. Moving on for Machines of War, we're going to continue to the 52K. The 52K is the last Soviet card. It is a 3-credit 2/2 artillery with a 2 operation cost of 2. It is a standard card, and it has deployment. Deal 4 damage to target enemy air unit. The 52K is actually very nice. The Soviets, up until this point, have not had a lot of ways to deal with air units. And especially whenever air units get into the meta, the Soviets often suffer. So the simple fact that this is a decent enough body alongside this effect is very, very powerful. In fact, you can even look at it and see that it is essentially just a burning sky with a body attached to it. And that's quite powerful. We've seen effects like this that have essentially that are usually not worth it on their own, but then see a lot more use when they're on a unit. And Burning Sky is a card that actually does see play in various Soviet values as a tech card against stuff like British Air or Ramp. So by essentially giving us a better form of that, we get the potential to diversify our removal options, and we can maybe breathe a bit easier. And maybe we don't have to rely, a Soviet deck does not have to rely as much on its ally in order to cover all removal options. Notably, the 52K also works quite well with Bloody Sickle. The reason being is that the 4 damage from the 52 and the 1 damage from Bloody Sickle is enough to kill the majority of air units in the game currently. There is a small amount of planes that really survive it, and only when you really get into some of the really expensive and big ones. Probably the most notable one being something like the Ju-88G6. But otherwise, there's actually not a lot. If you look, a lot of even the biggest and baddest planes like the Me-262, the Kika, alongside stuff like the Focke-Wulf 190, or if we go over to the bomber side, notably stuff like the B-17. These all essentially die to the 52 and Bloody Sickle combo. And that's quite flexible to fit into a deck, because most Soviet decks that are running the 52K are pretty much naturally going to be running Sickle, because Sickle is just so strong. So that is just overall a nice option for everything. And I think that the 52K is probably going to end up seeing play in a decent amount of value decks. I just think that it is flexible and covers an important niche that the Soviets otherwise have not had access to. Moving on, we're going to reach into the final card, at least the final new card in the Sakura Regiment. So this is a 1 cost, 1 operation, is a 1 credit, 1 operation cost infantry. It is a limited, so you get 3 copies. It is a 1/3, and it has +2 attack if you have fewer cards in the enemy hand, fewer cards in your hand than the enemy's. This is very easy to see as an aggro card, notably Japan aggro. These decks are always interested in 1-drops, especially something as big as potentially a 3/3. We've seen that through the power of stuff like 34th Regiment, that big 1-drops can be very, very strong. Granted, I think there is a big difference between ones that have 0 operation cost and those that have an actual operation cost. That slows down the power of the Sakura Regiment by making it so it is quite slow to play out compared to most normal Japan aggro units. With the lack of blitz and the 1 operation cost, you're paying more than you would be for other cards, but you do technically get probably the biggest unit that Japan aggro is really going to be running, and it comes at 1 cost or 1 credit, so that is potentially quite powerful. The condition is quite easy to meet, I would say, overall. There are a few times, especially in certain aggro mirrors, that you could potentially see this falter and only be a 1/3, and then it's actually pretty bad. But against most control decks or even most like mid-range decks, you're probably going to have this advantage. Notably, this could be quite interesting in Feigned Retreat, which is the premier Japan aggro deck, because you're able to pretty much always have less cards in hand after you pull that off, so these are always 3/3s, although the lack of speed there might make that a little less viable. There is some interesting idea with potentially playing it in resistance, because you're going to be able to constantly stuff the enemy's hand with resistance cards. You could potentially have a 1 credit 3/3 to help trade into the enemy's units or something like that. Granted, I think that's probably more of a fun idea to think about than it is a practical idea. But regardless, I think that Sakura is going to end up probably seeing play in various Japan aggro decks, at least in a few copies. If anything, it is, I think, quite good against decks like US Frontline, who often have a bigger hand and are also fighting for frontline control. And when you do something like that, the Sakura Regiment actually gives you a pretty big advantage. A 1 credit 3/3 is very cheap to get out and trades extremely well with most early and even most mid-game drops. With that said, that is all 7 cards revealed. Going over it just really quickly. I definitely think that one of the strongest cards coming out of the set is going to actually be the Southern Plan. I think in particular Southern Plan has a lot of potential, and I think that it has the potential to propel Japan into a legitimate control ally, or it could be a legitimate control ally now. It could be an actual ramp ally. I think there's just so much that Southern Plan could possibly enable, and even if none of that works out, it probably just goes into resistance on its own. So I think it's very likely Southern Plan is going to see play, and I think it's arguably the strongest option. Although that's not to say the rest of the set isn't strong also. Medical Battalion, the M4A2, the 52K, Sakura, pretty much every card I could expect to fit into some deck and have a legitimate effect on it. Otherwise, that is going to be it for today. Let me know down in the comments below which of these 7 cards you're most interested in. And before I go, we can actually take a look at the 3 alternate art cards. These are coming with the premium bundle for the World at War like they did last time. So let me know which one of these you find the most interesting, or which one you like the most. They don't offer any difference, they just offer different art, but I personally really like them. Otherwise, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe also. It always helps. I definitely have some deck ideas that I'll be coming out with in the short term. But otherwise, I wish you all a good day.